The rain had just stopped when Margaret Chen, one of the wealthiest women in the city, pulled on a pair of worn rubber gloves and tied a faded headscarf around her silver hair. At 72 years old, she had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small textile shop into a multinational corporation worth over $300 million. She had everything money could buy: mansions, luxury cars, designer clothes. Yet tonight, she stood in front of her mirror dressed in tattered clothing that smelled of mothballs and old cotton, preparing to become someone else entirely. Her hands trembled slightly as she smudged dirt across her face. Tomorrow morning she would walk into her son's home not as Margaret Chen, the powerful matriarch everyone feared and respected, but as an elderly garbage collector desperate for work. Because after months of hearing whispers and warnings about her daughter-in-law Elena, Margaret needed to know the truth. And the truth, she had learned long ago, never revealed itself to those who wore expensive jewelry and drove in chauffeured cars. If you believe that true character is revealed not in how we treat the powerful, but in how we treat the powerless, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Your support means everything. Margaret's son David had married Elena 3 years ago, a whirlwind romance that had skeptical written all over it. Elena was beautiful, charming, and always said exactly what people wanted to hear. At their wedding, she had held Margaret's hands and promised with tears in her eyes that she would love David forever, that she would care for him and any family they built together with all her heart. Margaret had wanted to believe her. She had wanted so desperately to believe that her only son had found genuine love. But over the past year, things had changed. David traveled frequently for business, and during his absences, Margaret began receiving troubling reports from neighbors and staff. They spoke of Elena's coldness toward the elderly housekeeper, of packages from expensive boutiques arriving daily while bills went unpaid, of strange cars in the driveway during David's trips abroad, yet whenever Margaret visited, Elena transformed into the perfect daughter-in-law, attentive, sweet, respectful. Margaret's late husband had always told her that you could judge a person's character by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. It was a lesson he had learned growing up poor in a village where the wealthy landlords showed their true nature in every interaction with farmers and servants. Now, decades after his death, Margaret would use his wisdom to uncover the truth about the woman who had married into her family. She had spent weeks planning this test, setting everything in motion with the precision that had made her a successful businesswoman. She had arranged for her trusted driver to take an extended vacation, ensuring no one would recognize her. She had rented a small, dingy apartment on the outskirts of town. She had even practiced the shuffling walk and humble demeanor of someone who had spent their life in hardship. The next morning, as the sun cast weak rays through gray clouds, Margaret stood at the back entrance of David and Elena's large colonial house. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, carried 2 large bags filled with collected bottles and cans, and kept her eyes downcast as she rang the service bell. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might give her away. When the door opened, Elena stood there in a silk robe, her face maskless and her hair in rollers, a version of herself that never appeared when David or Margaret were present. She looked at the elderly woman before her with undisguised irritation. Margaret spoke softly, keeping her voice hoarse and humble. She explained that she was a garbage collector who had seen the house had several bags of recyclables outside, and she wondered if the lady of the house might have any extra work she could do, perhaps cleaning, sorting, anything at all, in exchange for the recyclables and maybe a small payment. She explained that her grandson was sick and she needed money for medicine. As she spoke, she watched Elena's face carefully, seeing the calculations happening behind those beautiful eyes. For a long moment, Elena said nothing, simply looking Margaret up and down with an expression that made Margaret's blood run cold. Then Elena smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized they had found something useful. Elena told Margaret to wait outside, speaking to her as though she were something unpleasant that had washed up on the doorstep. She disappeared inside and returned 5 minutes later with a long list of tasks: scrubbing floors, cleaning windows, organizing the garage, washing the cars, tasks that would take days. She would pay $20 per day, she said, far below what such work deserved. But Margaret agreed without hesitation. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret worked in that house from dawn until dusk. She watched everything. She listened to everything. And what she discovered broke her heart in ways she had not anticipated. Elena treated her with casual cruelty that seemed to come naturally. She would leave food to rot deliberately so that Margaret would have to clean it up. She criticized every task even when done perfectly, finding fault and deducting money from the meager pay. She had Margaret use toxic cleaning chemicals without proper ventilation, dismissing her coughs with annoyance. But more than the personal mistreatment, Margaret witnessed something worse. She saw Elena speaking on the phone to a man who was clearly not David, discussing plans to meet, laughing in ways that suggested deep intimacy. She watched Elena forge David's signature on documents that Margaret later realized were property transfers. She overheard conversations with friends where Elena mocked David's trusting nature, calling him a fool who was too busy building his career to notice what was happening in his own home. One afternoon, while Margaret was scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, a young woman arrived at the door, someone Elena introduced as her friend Christina. As they sat drinking expensive wine that David had been saving for a special occasion, they talked freely, apparently forgetting or not caring that the old garbage collector was nearby. Christina asked Elena if she felt any guilt about what she was doing, about the deception. Elena's response cut through Margaret like a knife. She said that David and his mother were simply means to an end, that she had married into money with a plan, and that plan was nearly complete. She had already secured control of several properties and had transferred money into offshore accounts David knew nothing about. Once she had everything positioned correctly, she would divorce him and walk away with millions, while making it look like David's business failures had caused the losses. Margaret's hands stopped scrubbing, tears mixed with the dirty water on the floor. This was worse than she had imagined. This was not just a woman who was unkind or unfaithful. This was calculated theft, a destruction of her son's life planned with cold precision. But Margaret forced herself to remain still, to continue working as though she had heard nothing. She needed proof. Over the next few days, while Elena was out or distracted, Margaret used her phone to photograph documents, record conversations, gather evidence of every transaction and every scheme. Her heart ached with every discovery, but she persisted. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Margaret had been carrying heavy bags of trash to the bins when she slipped on wet leaves and fell hard on the concrete driveway. Pain shot through her hip and wrist. For a moment, she lay there unable to move, struggling to breathe through the shock. She heard the front door open and saw Elena standing there, looking down at her. For just a second, Margaret thought she might help, might show some human compassion. Instead, Elena told her to get up and stop being dramatic, that she was making a mess and the neighbors might see. When Margaret could not immediately rise, Elena threatened to withhold her entire week's pay if she did not clean up the scattered trash and finish her work. Something inside Margaret shifted in that moment. She had seen enough. She knew everything she needed to know. The next day, Margaret did not arrive for work. Instead, dressed in her finest business suit, her hair perfectly styled, her diamonds catching the morning light, she walked through the front door of the house using the key David had given her years ago. She found Elena in the living room, talking on the phone to the same man Margaret had heard so many times before. When Elena looked up and saw her, the phone slipped from her hand and shattered on the marble floor. Her face went white as recognition dawned. Recognition not just of her mother-in-law, but of the elderly garbage collector she had tormented for 2 weeks. Margaret stood tall, her voice steady and cold as she spoke. She told Elena that she knew everything. She detailed every conversation she had overheard, every document she had photographed, every moment of cruelty she had witnessed and endured. She explained that she had already contacted her lawyers and had frozen all the accounts Elena had tried to steal from. She had alerted the authorities about the fraud and forgery, but more than that, she had called David, who was on his way home at that very moment. Elena tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to cry and apologize and make excuses, but Margaret silenced her with a single,